Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CB. My name is Taylor Bilbrey and I'm today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. And as a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for the public record. Office hours recordings are available on the California ESG-CB past trainings webpage, and a copy of the slide deck and the recording will also be emailed to you. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide you with answers throughout the presentation as available. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. And alongside our presenters, we have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CB grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer your questions during the Q&A session. Okay, so for today's office hour session, our agenda includes ESG and ESG-CB updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESG-CB Q&A, and today's spotlight session. Oh, that's the error. We are talking about leases, habitability, and lead today.
Did she freeze?
I think Taylor is frozen for me as well. Not sure for anyone else.
Yeah, for me too. Yeah. I didn't know if it was just me.
No, that's okay. I think we can take over for her, but she's also sharing the slides. So if she's frozen, that might not work. There we go. Okay. I'll just keep taking over for her for now. So we do have some ESG upcoming events here. So stay tuned for these. The 2022 ESG award announcements will be posted in early May 2023. Sorry, Sarah, I just saw that you came off camera. Do you want to take over?
Sure. Sorry, guys. It's nice to be back. I've been kind of in and out for the last 3 weeks. Most people don't know, but I had COVID pretty good. So I'm sorry. 2022 ESG award announcements, those were a little delayed because I was out with COVID. I'm so sorry. I am going to our internal loan committee next week. So I'm hoping to have those announcements made the second week in May, and we can start hopefully routing contracts sooner than later. And then the 2023 ESG annual NOFAs are also looking like they're going to be released within the next couple of weeks. So sometime in May, it'll either be the second or the third week. So stay tuned for that. Sorry, hoping I don't have a coughing fit. Next slide, please. And then, of course, our ESG policy documents. Make sure that you check out all of the wonderful policies that ICF has really worked very hard with us with creating these policies. Remember, it's on our ESG webpage under the resources tab. Next slide, please. And then we have our ESG team representatives. We've got Diana Prado, Giovanni Martinez, Tuesday Cool, and Anthony Zepeda. Please make sure you reach out to your ESG representative listed above, or you can contact us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. And remember, the 2021 contracts are going to, the expenditure deadline is the end of August. We have not received a lot of RFFs. We still have more than 50% of our grant that needs to be expended. Please start getting your RFFs in now. We need to have those done at least quarterly. This is going to be something moving forward with our 2022s. You will be required to submit them at least quarterly if you have not already done so. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. I think that's it for us. Turn it back over to you, Taylor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and I apologize for my technical difficulties. However, it seems like it worked out perfectly for your updates. So I'm back, and let's talk about some ESG CV updates. So reminder for performance milestones, all program funds for projects such as street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and homelessness prevention must be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs must be expended by October 31st, 2023. And final requests for funds must be submitted to the department by November 15th, 2023. And let's talk through some reminders while you're planning for ESG CV closeout. Spend down timing. So we want to know when you're approaching the end and know that most funds are due to be spent by 9/30/2023. So don't spend too fast, but ensure the timing is just right there. And as far as funding continuity, consider HAP funding and other funding streams that will allow you to continue to serve clients after closeout. Closing intake. Set dates and deadlines to stop accepting clients and client intake and prepare for final rapid rehousing assistance. For staffing issues, just like we need to make sure we are not leaving participants with nowhere to go, we need to make sure we are thinking of ways to keep staff employed. Client issues. Make sure you involve and inform participants timely before assistance ends so they can prepare as well. No clients should become homeless because a program is closing. And let's talk through some HCD office hour updates. So upcoming on May 3rd, we have rental assistance agreements. May 10th, we have rent reasonableness and fair market rent for rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. May 17th, we have a racial equity toolkit session coming up. And on the 24th of May, we have eligibility documentation for rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. And we will drop the links to the training site in the chat, as well as the link to the past training schedule. Okay, we have a few more upcoming trainings. On May 2nd, we have documenting costs, new and non-traditional providers as a part of the new and non-traditional provider series. This session will cover all the basics needed to successfully submit an RFF to California HCD for payment. On May 10th, we have a data-driven decision-making community workshop session, and this session will explore the use of data in everything from program design to racial equity. And some upcoming trainings for June. On June 6th, we have a rent reasonableness policy clinic as part of the new and non-traditional provider series. And this session will review HUD's rules for rent reasonableness, learn about how to show rent reasonableness in California's higher priced housing market, and work together on the documentation required to complete a unit file. And we will drop these links in the chat as well. June 8th, we have an HMIS data quality program management session, the first session of that series with the community workshop series. And this session will focus on the data quality aspects of completeness and accuracy. How much of the required data do you have in HMIS, and how much is the data you have a reflection of any given person's reality? And another upcoming training in June on the 22nd, we have the HMIS Data Quality Program Management Session 2. And this session will review HUD's rules for rent reasonableness and learn about how to show rent reasonableness in California's higher priced housing market and work together on the documentation required for a unit. All right, I think that wraps up our first part of this session. And do we have any questions at this time before we move forward? Okay, I think I am ready to pass it along to David for our Spotlight series for today. Oh, I apologize. If you have any questions, you can contact the annual ESG team at esgnofa@hcd.gov, or for ESG-CV, you can reach out to your grant administrator. And now I will pass it over to David Munoz for our session today.
Thank you, Taylor, and welcome everybody. Hope your Wednesdays are off to a good start. As Taylor mentioned during our office hours presentation today, we'll be discussing leases, habitability, and lead. In a way, we're building off of the conversation that we had last week with Chris Andrews regarding habitability, except last week we focused a little bit more on how that would apply to emergency shelters. And this week, the idea is to focus on how these standards would apply to permanent housing. Next slide, please. So to kick us off, why are housing standards important? The ESG shelter and housing standards are the minimum or baseline standards to ensure decent, safe, and sanitary living environments. So in this case, we're really talking about permanent housing standards, which would apply to your homelessness prevention, as well as rapid rehousing activities. Next slide. Thank you. So what are the minimum standards? The minimum standards are set under 24 CFR 576-403B, as well as any of the state and local government safety and sanitation standards, if applicable. So while the implementing regulations or the ESG regulations set that minimum or baseline standard for what each one of those units, the condition of each one of those units should be, if a grantee has more stringent standards and says, you know, the minimum standards that ESG sets are not sufficient, then the grantee is then responsible for ensuring that, you know, whether it's a shelter or the housing unit meets those standards. And so that is obviously a choice that the grantee or local government is going to have to make. But just note that if the grantee has, you know, standards that are below those in the ESG requirements, the grantee is still responsible for meeting those minimum standards that are part of the ESG program. To ensure that each one of those units being occupied by an ESG beneficiary meet those minimum standards, inspection should be completed before the unit is occupied. If the unit is to continue to be occupied by an individual, so in a homeless prevention case, then that inspection should be completed of that unit. If an individual, however, is being moved from one unit to a new unit, there's no need to inspect the unit that they're leaving. However, an inspection of the unit that they will be moving into should be completed before it is occupied by that program participant or beneficiary. The unit must remain habitable and should follow these standards for as long as the unit is in use. And I believe on the next slide, we'll kind of get into the details of it. We'll talk about applicability of the housing standards first. So the housing standards for sanitation, safety, and privacy are required when ESG funds are used for rapid rehousing activities, including relocation and stabilization services, as well as homeless prevention, including relocation and stabilization services, which is applicable even if the client is staying in the unit. And then these standards would apply regardless of the amount of assistance provided, even if it's just a security deposit or moving costs. So if the service being provided under the homeless prevention or rapid rehousing activity is in any way connected to that beneficiary staying in the existing unit or moving into a new, or am I not appearing?
We see you now, and I see slides on my end, so I'm not sure why Karen is having issues.
Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. So where were we? We were, yes, any type of service being provided, if it is in direct connection to a client or a beneficiary staying in their existing unit or moving into another unit, would mean that these requirements apply. So if under homeless prevention, you only paid for the security deposit or the moving costs, because that service or that assistance is directly related to that beneficiary gaining access to that unit must meet the minimum standards established in the ESG requirements. That also includes lead-based paint remediation and disclosure, which would apply to all ESG-funded housing units that are occupied by ESG as well as ESG-CV participants. And so here is kind of an overview of the various minimum standard components. So starting with the structure and materials, ensuring that it's structurally sound, would pass like a building inspection or code inspection, the space and security of the facility, the interior air quality. So does it have sufficient ventilation, whether natural or some type of machine, the water supply, ensuring that it's not contaminated, the sanitary facilities. So there should be some ability for those participants to kind of bathe and also make waste or, dispose of human waste. The thermal environment should, be reasonable. Illumination, electricity, there should be the ability to plug in electrical outlets to plug in devices. There should be lighting or sufficient lighting, which can also include, windows for natural light, food preparation, making sure that those areas are clean, sanitary, which kind of blends into sanitary conditions overall. And then lastly is fire safety. And I think fire safety is one of those areas where it goes above and beyond kind of those housing quality standards or HQS. So, making sure that there's sufficient exit routes and ensuring that there are things like smoke detectors. Next. And so if you go on the HUD Exchange, there are sample checklists that have been developed for use by grantees and subrecipients to assess whether or not the minimum standards have been met by the structure of the property or the unit. And so it basically lists out all of those standards that we went through in the previous slide and allows whomever is conducting that inspection to say, hey, the structure and materials, those are approved, space security, that's approved. But maybe, they noticed that the AC was broken. And so maybe some of those, the interior air quality would be deficient. And so as part of that inspection, they're noting down what they see. It becomes a list of, remedial actions that need to be taken to ensure that that unit is up to standard so that when it is occupied by a beneficiary, everything in this checklist should be in the approved status. Okay. With respect to ESG-CV, there are some additional flexibilities that were provided and waivers that were provided through some of those notices, namely that you can utilize housing quality standards in lieu of ESG minimum habitability standards for permanent housing. And as I had kind of mentioned in the previous slide, I think that the main difference is really the applicability of those fire standards. A lot of the other components of the minimum habitability standards are also in the housing quality standards. It's just that the ESG minimum habitability standards go just a little bit further. But if you don't have those, then for ESG CV only, you're able to utilize those housing quality standards. It also waives the requirement that habitability or housing quality standards must be conducted, inspections must be conducted prior to providing housing relocation or stabilization services under homeless prevention. So normally, as I had said, you want to make sure that that unit is in appropriate condition prior to, but in the case of ESG-CV under homeless prevention, there is a little bit of wiggle room there. So moving on to the lead-based paint requirements. The lead-based paint requirements would apply to all ESG-CV funded housing. And it's really applicable in situations where the property or the unit that is being assisted was built prior to 1978. Alternatively, if that unit or property may be occupied by a child or an individual that's pregnant, then the lead-based paint requirements would apply, meaning you would likely have to conduct an inspection. As part of any kind of activity that is covered by the lead-based paint requirements, must issue the lead-based paint disclosure to all of the program participants. There's a couple of kind of pamphlets. You'll likely want to distribute those both in English as well as any other limited English proficiency language identified in your LEP or language access plan. And on top of that, you'll want to conduct a lead visual inspection. So during COVID, they kind of allowed folks to even utilize their phones to kind of go through and record the condition of that, property or that unit. If you're able to go on site, you're still able to do a visual inspection. So if you're doing kind of the perimeter of that property, you're looking at the condition of the paint. Is any of it chipped off? And if any kind of issues are identified, then potential remediation actions may be necessary. You'll generally come into these situations, especially when properties were built before 1978. And so in those cases, you may want to get a report on any type of lead-based paint remediation actions that have been taken on that property. It's likely that if that property has been assisted with federal funds in the past, they may have done some things already. And so getting a report of what's been done thus far, if there's any kind of continual remedial actions that need to be taken, if those are being followed and so forth. Next slide. So to kind of assist with the visual inspection, there is this checklist that can be completed where they would enter the name of the participant, the information about the property or the unit. So that would be the address, the unit, city, and then go through this questionnaire to kind of determine or document the results of that visual inspection. So starting with when the year that the property was built. So was it constructed before or after 1978? Who is likely to be occupying that unit? So again, child under 6, individual that's pregnant. And then if there's any other kind of exemptions from lead-based paint. So if it's an efficiency, 0 bedroom SRO, if there was lead-based paint previously identified on the property, it has been remediated. Again, maintaining some of those records or obtaining some of those records so that you can demonstrate, hey, yes, it did have lead-based paint. It's been remediated. Here's what was done. And then if there is kind of the presence of deteriorated paint, noting where, hopefully taking some pictures and so forth so that you can kind of have that. And then if there's any kind of remedial actions that need to be taken as a result of that, continuing to do that until it's all cleared. Now, with respect to rental assistance agreements, the service provider and the owner or the landlord must have entered into a rental assistance agreement to establish the terms of rental assistance, so how much, when does that start, when does it end, how, so, or, what's the frequency in which those payments are occurring. And the provider must receive any notice to the program participant to vacate or any complaint under state local law to commence eviction. And it must also include all applicable protections as required by the Violence Against Women's Act, or VAWA. So making sure that as you review a rental or a lease agreement or rental assistance agreement, making sure that it contains all of the necessary information as well as provisions. So it's not just as simple as saying, hey, this unit, this much rent. It's, is the participant there? What's the address, the unit? What's, the terms of assistance? Here's when they moved in. This is the end date of that. This is how much is owed on a monthly basis. This is how much the security deposit and so forth. The rental agreement having that level of detail then enables the service provider to make timely payments in accordance with that rental assistance agreement. So if it's due on the 1st, making sure that that service provider is providing the payments on the 1st. If there's a grace period, making note of that. Any late payment penalty requirements, as part of the participant's lease, must actually be paid with non-ESG funds. So if you're late, and as a result, you're having to pay X percentage per day, all of those late fees that are accumulated cannot be paid for with ESG funds. And the reason for that is the intent of the rental assistance agreement is to make sure that everyone's in agreement in terms of when those payments should be issued. Next slide, please. So continuing on rental agreements, the tenants must have written executed lease with the property owner or the landlord. It should be current. So if, let's say, the rental agreement between the landlord and the tenant expired or ended, generally what you want to look for is the provisions within the agreement in terms of what happens in the event that the tenant still occupies that property past or beyond the end date. Sometimes they'll say, hey, it goes month to month, but ideally you would get a renewed kind of lease once that rental agreement is up. It must also include all of the applicable protections as required by VAWA. There is an exception if assistance is solely for arrears assistance. So if there's nothing forward-looking, kind of thinking like under a homeless prevention program where you're just paying arrears, you may not need that rental agreement. You'll just need an oral agreement may be accepted if the agreement gives program participant an enforceable leasehold and rent owed is documented by the owner's financial records. Next slide. Okay, and that is our office hours discussion. Let me see if I can pull up the questions. Or are people allowed to just ask questions, or are we doing, let me see.
Yes.
Okay.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to come off mute. However, we do have one question right now that hasn't been addressed from Eva Pesto. And it says, if one or both is not a visual assessment and it's not triggered, then it states if the answer to both is yes, then it is triggered. Which statement is true?
Could we pull up the slides one more time?
Yeah, so our lead-based paint, one, it says if there's an answer to no, you don't have to go any further. Then at the bottom, it says stop if there's a yes to either one. And the pregnant women aren't listed on the current form.
We go to the, yes.
That's this one right here. So it has to be before 1978 and a child under 6 to trigger an inspection.
I think that we'll do some research on this, but it may be that instead of both, it needs to be either. Because if the property was constructed prior to 1978, and none of the other exemptions apply.
Because it sounds like you're only saying if there's a kid under 6, kind of has to be included.
I see what you're saying.
David, I think that it's either or.
So then if after 1978, yeah, that actually would make sense. Then the only update that may need to be made here is for individuals that could be pregnant for number 2.
So if it's yes to 78, it also has to be yes to the pregnant and under 6 in order to trigger it.
That is my understanding of the way
Okay.
that this is currently written, yes.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from anyone? Well, I don't see that there are any other questions in the chat, nor is anyone coming off of mute, so we won't prolong you.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Okay.
This is Marche with Path Orange County. In regards to the habitability standards for those who are focused with the ESG-CV for homeless prevention, would an example be like our interim shelter has ESG-CV funding and they placed a client in hotel. So because it's homeless prevention, would it be exempt from the lead-based inspection? Or does that inspection have to be done at still a certain point before the client is placed in that hotel?
I believe within ESG-CV, if you recall, when that inspection occurs, doesn't necessarily have to be before they're placed in that motel, precisely for the situation that you're describing. However, that's not to say that the inspection does not need to occur at all. The inspection should still occur at that motel site to ensure that it's still meeting those habitability standards. However, the ESG-CV waivers and flexibilities allowed for that process to be a little bit more expeditious, so that you could place an individual in that motel while you got the staff necessary to go out there and conduct those inspections. Whereas in a traditional sense, you would want to conduct an inspection of that unit prior to moving a program participant into that unit.
Awesome. Thank you for the clarification.
And thank you again to David. Anyone else with any more questions? Please don't be shy, because 9 times out of 10, your question is a question that someone else wants to ask as well. But seeing no questions and no more hands raised, thank you, David, for this session, and thank you for everyone in attendance. Please remember that a survey will pop up as you exit the session, so please answer that question for us so that we can better serve you all. And we will look forward to seeing you next week at office hours. Have a good day.